on the other one, you bastard!
Fansproject, one of the most legendary companies in the Transformers third-party web space. They were one of the first third-party companies to truly throw their hat in the ring of unlicensed Transformers. And their aesthetic, although vastly different to mainline, left such a lasting impact that has still influenced many third-party companies to this day. That being said, these days a lot of what they've released has been forgotten and replaced by what other companies have put out. For example, Chrome Dome, well, Make Toys has you covered. Springer, well, Hasbro's got you covered twice over. Insecticons? Are you kidding me? Dinobots? Are you kidding me? A couple of releases have held on in the modern era, however, simply because there aren't that many figures that can actually replace them. For example, Menasor doesn't have that many better versions considering the cartoon model looks like garbage. Highbrow hasn't gotten a replacement because Make Toys never got around to doing their design. And then there's Broadside. Honestly, I'm baffled why nobody's done a Broadside yet. However, there is one release that fans consistently insist is better than the Hasbro version. Well, let's take a look. 6 years on, how is this wrecking dude holding up? Greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Fansproject Warbot 004 Revolver Core, also known as Roadbuster. Taking a look at this fella in vehicle mode, you can see that third-party Transformers have come a long way in the 6 years since this was released. Right off the bat, this figure has a vastly different aesthetic to that which most of us are used to seeing. Don't get me wrong, the aesthetic has changed and evolved as time has gone on, heavily influencing the likes of Iron Factory, Make Toys, Cross Dimensions, and even Fans Hobby. But taking a look at this guy is like looking at a time capsule, in the sense that the child version of 3P was messy. Yeah, in vehicle mode, it really seems to be putting an emphasis on the fan in Fansproject, because this looks like a 3D printed design more than a cohesive Transformer. Although ironically, a lot of what we get in terms of 3D printed fan designs these days have greatly outclassed what Fansproject has done here. That's not to say it isn't a nice vehicle mode, it's very pleasing to look at. The colours, by virtue of being Roadbuster's colours, are quite lovely, and there is a lot of paint to pick out the small details. They haven't spared any expense in this department, and the types of details they've picked out give them quite the anime aesthetic. For specifics, it's got a nostalgia for 2000s mech shows before the fall. Before the catastrophe! The back section does the job of using the leg mass quite well, and the decision to hide the double hinge as pistons is genius. I mean, sure, the back section does look a little bit messy, but at least they've incorporated the crotch plate to fill out the gaps. Furthermore, the decisions to use the handgun as the bumper. But everything else, I'm sorry, it's just messy. It's not that I don't have a taste for these sorts of things. Looking at the other figures from Fansproject's catalogue, this one just doesn't seem to hold up to any scrutiny. And even ignoring Fansproject in general, looking at the recent stuff Fans Hobby is doing, that looks like a true evolution of this style. In fact, many have hypothesized that several of Fansproject's staff left and moved on to Fans Hobby. Apparently some of the other staff went to Mars Toys as well, which means at this point in the video it's time for the customary Mars Toys salute.
You're a
The biggest offender of this messy design would have to be the front. The wheels jut out way too far, and yet somehow the outward side of the truck doesn't come out far enough. It's a weird oxymoron that makes sense in hand, but I imagine it isn't coming across on camera very well. The multi-layered orange top section could hypothetically work, but it's just so blocky and there are way too many hinges everywhere to make it look any interesting. And then the one place where they skimped on paint. The one place just so happens to be the most important section, the headlights. Without those, this thing just doesn't even look like a car, it looks like a hodgepodge. The seating section is also pretty awful. The feet are super obvious and there's no flow to the outside section. Also, the windscreen is far too small, and before you tell me it's a stylistic choice, it's really not. It's that small because they wanted it to fold into the shoulders during transformation. Nothing more, nothing less. And yeah, I get the idea of changing the design for the sake of functionality, but there really needs to be a balance. Besides, the functionality they went with doesn't end up working at all, but I'll save that for the robot mode. And even then, sometimes they do the reverse. You've got these lovely pinned wheels at the front here, so hypothetically he could roll very well, but then you've got these solid plastic treads at the back here and they don't roll at all. I'm not asking for functioning rubber treads like Combiner Wars Megatron, those are often way more trouble than they're worth. I'm just asking for a couple of fake wheels on the bottom, like most treaded figures these days. Also, they didn't glue my copy properly, so one of the treads pops off. Probably just a QC issue though, I doubt every copy on the planet is affected. You may be asking, why does he have an open seating area when they haven't sculpted any seats? Well, that question brings us to the accessories. This right here is the the core figure, which they include with most of their releases. It's a sort of Power Master guy, and I do quite like it. That said, construction-wise, there's a lot of bad that comes with the good. Surprisingly, I really like the head sculpt. There's a lot they're able to do given the size, even if it is a bit too far back in terms of proportions. The limbs are also painted very well, especially the legs. I love the green paint they've used. Unfortunately, the torso gets none of that lovely paint, although given how it has to transform, and those parts will be rubbing against each other, it is understandable. What's less understandable is the waist section, which, I don't know how to describe without getting demonetized. Let's just say it's bad. Articulation is also a little bit weak. The head is on a ball joint, as are the arms. The elbows, though, are stuck under these huge kibble sections, which is kind of stupid. Then you've got ball joints and hinges for the legs. Considering he's not actually that small, and that a lot of small-scale figures have been able to incorporate far better articulation into them, I feel a thigh swivel should have been put here at the very least. Also the arms. They suck. End of story. Still, he can sit down in the cabin if you like, and it kinda works. Not really. There are no tabs for him to lock into, so he ends up wobbling around aimlessly. Puts into perspective how well Hasbro did with their Headmasters 2 years later. In terms of other accessories, you get 2 extra guns, aside from the ones already acting as the bumper. I've lost one, as is customary for this channel. Oh wow, what a surprise! As I was cleaning up my room, I did actually come across the remaining gun. It's got a little hinge here, so I imagine you can plug that in, rotate it, or stick it underslung under the arm like that. But I'm not going to touch that because I don't want to break 2 guns. The other guns are a little bit more sturdy, but this one, nah, I ain't touching that. But anyways, and the other illustrates my biggest issue with this figure. The plastic quality is a bit Now I get it, when Third Party first started out they didn't have access to many of the plastics that Hasbro and Takara used, and still use for that matter. That said, in the year 2014, several companies were already making the switch to those kinds of plastics, and it was working for the better. Even if you were forced to use the softer plastics, there are ways to make it work without sacrificing the integrity of the figure. The one key thing to do, which is something the designers of Masterpiece Hound didn't take into account, is make sure all of your parts are chunky and solid, so no breakages will occur. And on that topic, breakages have occurred. Warning! Under no circumstances are you to plug any of the weapons into the back of the truck. They will get stuck, they will break, and you will cry. And that's not even the worst of it. Yes, the literal breakage of parts isn't even the worst element of why using this plastic in such a way is awful. But to answer the rest of that question, we need to get into the robot mode. So for now, size comparisons. There's a lot more plastic in general compared to most Voyagers, even taking into account the bulky ones. But despite his size, he feels a lot lighter than some deluxes. Another thing that I've said before in another review, and I'll reiterate it here, Transformers differ from most action figures due to their incorporation of a transformation. As such, the tactile nature of any Transformer, official or unofficial, is something that's key in designing it. The figure has to feel good, as you'll be much more likely to mess with a Transformer than you are with a statue of Megumin. Or at least I'd hope so. But putting that aside, I do like this mode. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty bad. In terms of personal biases though, I do have somewhat of an ironic love for the design. There's a lot they tried to do, and I respect that, even if it didn't end up working so well. That said, when placed next to the official Hasbro version, which oddly enough came out the same year, yeah, there's no contest, Hasbro easily takes the win. The Fansproject version is ironically slightly closer to the G1 vehicle mode when it comes to basic design, despite being a complete mess. But honestly, the Hasbro one looks better overall and captures the spirit of the character more effectively. Plus, not only does it actually look cohesive, but the colours are far richer, not to mention he actually rolls. I'm neither a Hasbro fanatic nor a third-party elitist, I just acknowledge good toys when I see them, and in this instance, Hasbro made a good toy. Before I want to show you the transformation of Roadbuster over here, I want to bring in this. This is the Diaclone version of New Age's Ironhide. Why do I have this here? Well, we know that Jizai Toys, the one known for Robo-Jesus, is responsible for New Age's designs because Ironhide was actually released by Jizai Toys online and then later picked up by New Age. Well, I say that to say that we also know that Jizai Toys at some point worked for Fansproject, and as such, you can really see a lot of the similarities between these two figures. That being said, Roadbuster definitely feels far less refined than old Ironhide over here, and I know people had their grievances with Ironhide, but there's a bit of lackluster elements to Roadbuster as well. The first thing you want to do is remove the gun assembly from the hands. It's just pegged into the 5mm hands over there, and when they go in, they just peg in together like so and then plug in. And you'll notice that the hands are actually backwards, and they have to remain backwards so that everything plugs in properly. First thing you want to do is fold these panels here, then you take these feet and detach them from this whole section here. In fact, you'll notice there's a peg there and a slot there that detaches well, and you just move that to the side there. You also come around to the bottom and close up this section here. You rotate the foot 180 degrees, and you need to make sure it's actually facing upwards, otherwise the leg won't transform properly. Then you move the tread around, oriented like so. Then there's a double hinge on the panel here, and that just comes around and covers up the leg. It does actually peg in like so, but as I said, it won't go all the way. If the foot's in the way, you'll see the foot gets in the way and it doesn't really work. Now the arms are unfortunately annoying as shit. The first thing you want to do is bring that out of the way so that everything is a bit easier. Untab the top here and untab the bottom as well, and the whole thing just kind of rotates downwards. You bring these sections up a little bit, they've got the windscreen on them. Rotate the windscreens into these cavities over here, and then collapse them into the tops of the shoulders. The fists rotate outwards, sort of 90 degrees. Then you come underneath and fold the wheel in 90 degrees. Then you come back over again, and that'll give you enough clearance to rotate the arm down, and that will detach that peg from that slot. And then come to the bottom again and collapse the panels. And don't forget to rotate the wrists 180 degrees. I keep forgetting to do that. You may need to make sure the arms are oriented correctly. They might not quite be oriented correctly. At this point, you want to rotate the waist section 180 degrees and collapse that section into the torso. You want to come in the inside here and push up the head panel, and then there's this panel on a sliding rail that slides down into there. You can then collapse the entire torso, and that sort of locks into place, and if it's all done right, the head should be there. Then you want to go to the core figure. There's a little sort of opening over there which the head folds down into. You want to rotate the legs ever so slightly backwards so that you've got a bit more clearance, and then use this kind of double hinge, and these things kind of rotate around there, and this all locks into place. You've then got a tab here and a slot there, and that just rotates in place there. Same with this side, just locks in. And oh look, there's the slot there which the slot mechanism goes into, like boom, like so. You then come around to these panels over here, well I guess not panels, more little canopy sections, and they just kind of hook over the sides, and there's a slot and a tab there, but they don't tab in very well, which is going to be a bit of a problem later on. But that locks the fake waist swivel used for transformation and unlocks the real transformation. And oh joy, here we have Impactor in his robot mode, and jeez, he is one big pile of disappointment. You know what? It's actually a bit of an odd situation in robot mode. In the vehicle mode, the construction was solid enough, but the aesthetics were all over the place. But in robot mode, it's the opposite. Looks-wise, I can see why Roadbuster is held in such high regard. He's utterly gorgeous from head to toe, using some of the segmented design to his advantage. The head doesn't really echo the design, nor the overall feel of Roadbuster, partly by being the wrong shape and color. But it is done quite nicely, and the piercing blue visor is striking to look at. From the front, the arms are quite messy, but as a result, it looks like they've been bulked up in armor, which is befitting of a wrecker. The chest almost feels like a combat vest, and although it's massively underpainted, it does provide a nice central piece to look at. Oddly enough, the best element of the design would have to be the legs. The legs aren't really what you would consider a defining feature of Roadbuster, but they've gone for the anime proportions going here with the extremely long legs juxtaposed with the short torso and arms. And when they add all this detail, it really works. Again, the hinges are disguised as piston details, which look quite lovely. There's also paint aplenty, and even the back, legs or not, cleans up quite well. Unfortunately, when you get to the bottom of the robot, you realize the main problem that truly kills any excitement with this figure. The plastic ruins the joint tolerances. All of the joint tolerances! Discussing the big convoy in the room, he can't stand for shit. It's not that they didn't make the tolerances right here, it's that fundamentally you just can't use this kind of plastic to make tight joints. In the end, you need to use something much more sturdy, and considering several third-party companies were switching to those plastics at the time, this decision just seems either lazy or narcissistic. But I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they didn't have access to those materials at the time. Maybe something along the lines of manufacturing issues occurred. Okay, so given that this is a niche product, you're not really limited by a release schedule. This leaves you with two options. Delay the figure until you can use those kinds of materials, or design the figure in such a way that doesn't require a tight joint that you physically can't do. Perhaps a similar foot design to Optimus Prime or Fans Toys Quakewave would be more appropriate. This allows gravity to hold the elements in place, and you still get access to the ankle tilt. There are numerous ways in which they could have fixed this, and honestly I don't think it's the fault of the designer. It seems to be the fault of the company. That hubris is probably Fansproject's Achilles heel, and it permeated the company throughout their lineup, causing outdated design after outdated underrated design, until they ended up stopping figure design entirely, probably just letting Fans Hobby take the reins. Okay, so after writing this script, I was scrolling through Twitter and this shit came up. An unreleased Fans Hobby version of Roadbuster. Not gonna lie, this shit needs a lot of work. But that's all side shit, and we've still got present shit to deal with. The head mechanism doesn't lock in anywhere, relying on friction to keep it in place. This causes the platform to slide down if you're not careful, and when posing this guy, it's a massive pain in the ass, since his head is already surrounded by collar tooling. Had the panel locked into place, this assembly would have worked fine, but as it stands, it's an exercise in frustration. The arms do look quite lovely, but posing them is also a pain. The kibble chooses aesthetics over functionality, and there are many points where posing just doesn't work. For example, trying to get the arm out 90 degrees without rotating, it just doesn't work due to the wheel being in the way. You can use the extra torso hinge, but that's due to transformation and it breaks the sculpt of the chest, which in my mind is a big no-no. Furthermore, said torso hinges are very flimsy and I'm concerned it's going to break at some point. Thank f*** I'm gonna leave this in storage for 9 months until the worst of 2020 video comes out. Yeah, I said it. This figure will probably end up on that list. And it's doubtful it'll just get an honorable mention. On the topic of not locking into place, the forearm section is a joke. The wrist section just folds out without any friction whatsoever. Either put a tab in there or make the joint tight enough. Oh wait, you can't make the joint tight enough because of the plastic used. See what I mean? Then you've got the kibble on the back, which isn't the worst thing since Ectotron 1, but again, it just doesn't tab in anywhere. When you're dealing with two different joints that can come undone, you end up having to be extremely careful when posing him. Otherwise, he'll just look messy. And again, the arms do look very good, but there are so many little touches they should have done to really solidify the piece. Although if we're talking aesthetics, there are a few issues as well. They are minor, but they add to the pile of frustrations. The outer section of the forearm is just an exposed joint, and it doesn't really flow with the design. It is super distracting. Also, the chest is massively underpainted. It does have a tampo graph here, which hypothetically could look nice, but choosing an orange tampo on orange plastic is pretty stupid. I can't even read the damn thing! Finally, the shoulders look hella unfinished at the top. I don't understand the obsession of having the windscreen fold in here. Not only does it make the shoulders look ugly as hell, but again it makes the vehicle mode look extremely lackluster as well. It's a baffling design choice that stuffs up the aesthetic of both modes. And this is one thing I can call the designer out for. Thank God his, or her, later work isn't this unfinished. The final nail in the coffin would have to be the core section. When you're dealing with what is essentially a Power Master, it's important to make sure it actually stays locked in. And sometimes it does, but these backpack pylons refuse to stay in place, and it causes the actual core to jostle around in its cavity. There's not even that much benefit to having it in there. It doesn't unlock any crazy features, and they could have easily filled up the gap regardless. You can't even tell whether it's been installed or not from the front, which even in average play is one of the most important elements of a gimmick. Visibility. I'm not saying this gimmick can't be done well, but the way it's implemented is both dubious and incredibly stupid. Even the articulation is unbelievably cursed, where each element has something specifically wrong with it that renders it useless. It has a ball-jointed head that gets gimped by the shoulder detailing. The shoulders have universal joints, but again, the kibble ruins it. The bicep swivel works fine, and the 90-degree elbow almost works, but thanks to the wheel assembly, if you rotate it at any angle other than 90, it doesn't work properly. At least the wrists work, yippee. He has a waist swivel, and it's ridiculously loose. Thank f*** it doesn't have to support any weight. He has ball-jointed hips that get perfect forward and backward motion, but barely 45 degrees outwards. God damn it, just when I thought I had finally found unhampered thighs. God! The only other element that works perfectly aside from the wrists would have to be the thighs, which I guess is nice. Hooray for thigh swivels. The double jointed knees, which are used for transformation, give you a full range of motion, but when standing in a neutral pose, you have to put them in a chicken leg orientation, otherwise the weight will topple the whole damn thing over thanks to the feet. Speaking of, the feet rotate downward due to the transformation, but as said earlier, they're far too loose. Finally, the ankles work at the front, but the back is just this tiny ass panel, so balancing him just doesn't work. Props to Jizai Toys for at least attempting to give him as much articulation as possible, but it's clear that as this is an earlier design, it doesn't quite have the same finesse that other figures exhibit. Allegedly, I still can't confirm it's the same designer, but come on, it totally is. Now size-wise, he is a fairly tall fella, putting him at least a head or two taller than most classic or modern Voyagers. I suppose that's nice for the main muscle of the Wreckers, but at the end of the day, that's all he's got going for him. He can barely even stand in a static pose, meaning that his good looks don't count for anything. And maybe, just maybe, maybe he would have worked on a shelf if he was compatible with a figure stand, but this is 2014. It's not like most figures were compatible with, oh look, Thrilling 30 Roadbuster is compatible with a figure stand after all. Come to think of it, even in robot mode, the Thrilling 30 version outclasses it in every single way. And when you take everything into account, the vehicle mode is far more solid, it looks better, the transformation is simpler but much more refined and way more fun to handle. The robot mode exudes authority, it's painted extremely well, and even though it's got slightly less articulation, everything that he does have, at the very least, works properly. With the exception of the weight. The feet aren't really the best, and he can topple over. In that regard, the Fansproject and Hasbro versions are a little similar, but even then the Thrilling 30 version does it slightly better, because it only sometimes falls over. Like I said, I'm not typically one to prefer official or unofficial Transformers exclusively. I am one to enjoy and despise toys from either side of the fence. And in this instance, Fansproject simply swung and missed. But I suppose that is to be expected of a toy that came out during third party's infancy. Except it didn't. This figure released in 2014, which was the same year as reformatted Azalea, reformatted Feral Rex, Make Toys Quantron, and Make Toys Utopia, all of which didn't have the issues that Roadbuster here did. This was far from the infancy of third party. If I'm being very liberal with my definitions, the best I could give it is the twilight of the teenage years. And at that point, this subsection of the fandom was well on its way to maturity. And even then, the same year, Hasbro was offering a much better alternative at a third of the price, or if we're dealing with American prices, a quarter. I'm sorry, but Revolver Core just isn't that good. He's aged terribly, and even when he first came out, he was terribly dated. I'm sorry, but Fansproject doesn't get a pass just because they were first out of the gate, and considering they've all but vanished, it seems like they've gotten their comeuppance for their hubris. Maybe they'll return to the front lines in the future, but if they make a toy that's as dated as Revolver Core was back then, I ain't interested.